Señor presidente Barack Obama, nos complace recibirlo en la primera visita de un mandatario de los Estados Unidos a nuestro país después de 88 años. Constatamos que en los 15 meses transcurridos, desde que anunciamos la decisión de restablecer las relaciones diplomáticas, hemos obtenido resultados concretos. Reanudamos el correo postal directo y firmamos un acuerdo para restablecer los vuelos regulares. Hemos ampliado la cooperación en áreas de interés mutuo. Suscribimos 2 memorándums de entendimiento sobre protección de medio ambiente y áreas marinas y otro para mejorar la seguridad de la navegación marítima. Hoy se firmará uno más sobre cooperación en la agricultura. Actualmente se está negociando otro grupo de instrumentos bilaterales para cooperar en esferas como el enfrentamiento al narcotráfico, la seguridad del comercio y de los viajeros y la salud. Sobre esta última, hemos acordado profundizar la colaboración en la prevención y tratamiento de enfermedades transmisibles como el Zika y de enfermedades crónicas no transmisibles, incluyendo el cáncer. Esta cooperación es beneficiosa no solo para Cuba y los Estados Unidos, sino también para nuestro hemisferio. A partir de las decisiones adoptadas por el presidente Obama para modificar la aplicación de algunos aspectos del bloqueo, empresas cubanas y sus contrapartes estadounidenses trabajan en la identificación de posibles operaciones comerciales que se pudieran concretar en el marco aún restrictivo de las regulaciones en vigor. Algunas se han materializado especialmente en el área de las telecomunicaciones, ámbito en el que nuestro país cuenta con un programa basado en sus prioridades de desarrollo y en la necesaria soberanía tecnológica que garantiza el uso apropiado de estas al servicio de los intereses nacionales. También se avanza en negociaciones para la adquisición de medicamentos, equipos médicos y equipamiento para generación de energía y protección del medio ambiente, entre otras. Mucho más pudiera hacerse si se levantara el bloqueo de los Estados Unidos. Reconocemos la posición del presidente Obama y de su gobierno contra el bloqueo y los reiterados llamados que ha hecho al Congreso para que lo elimine. Las últimas medidas adoptadas por su gobierno son positivas, pero no suficientes. Intercambié con el presidente sobre otras medidas que pensamos pueden tomarse para eliminar restricciones aún vigentes y hacer una importante contribución al desmantelamiento del bloqueo. Esto es esencial porque el bloqueo continúa en vigor y tiene componentes disuasivos y efectos intimidatorios de alcance extraterritorial, sobre lo cual le puse algunos ejemplos al presidente para mostrarle sus consecuencias negativas para Cuba y otros estados. El bloqueo es el obstáculo más importante para nuestro desarrollo económico y el bienestar del pueblo cubano. Por eso, su eliminación será esencial para normalizar las relaciones bilaterales. También será beneficioso para la emigración cubana, que desea lo mejor para sus familias y su país. Para avanzar hacia la normalización, también será necesario que se devuelva el territorio ilegalmente ocupado por la base naval de Guantánamo. Ambos temas, por ser los principales obstáculos, fueron abordados una vez más en el editorial publicado el 9 de marzo pasado en el órgano oficial del Partido Comunista de Cuba, y hace solo 4 días en la conferencia de prensa de nuestro canciller Bruno Rodríguez Parrilla, ampliamente divulgado por la prensa. Asimismo, otras políticas debieran ser suprimidas para que pueda haber relaciones normales entre Cuba y los Estados Unidos. No debiera pretenderse para ello que el pueblo cubano renuncie al destino que libre y soberanamente ha escogido y por el que ha hecho inmensos sacrificios. Intercambiamos además sobre temas internacionales, en particular aquellos que pudieran afectar la paz y la estabilidad regional. Especialmente estaba previsto y no hubo tiempo para concluirlo, era abordar nuestra preocupación por la situación de desestabilización que se intenta fomentar en Venezuela, lo cual es contraproducente para el ambiente en el continente, pero lo expreso en esta ocasión. Igualmente, dialogamos sobre la marcha del proceso de paz en Colombia y los esfuerzos para poner fin a este conflicto. Existen profundas diferencias entre nuestros países que no van a desaparecer, pues tenemos concepciones distintas sobre muchos temas, como los modelos políticos, la democracia, el ejercicio de los derechos humanos, la justicia social, las relaciones internacionales, la paz y la estabilidad mundial. Defendemos los derechos humanos. Consideramos que los derechos civiles, políticos, económicos, sociales y culturales son indivisibles, interdependientes y universales. No concebimos que un gobierno no defienda y garantice el derecho a la salud, la educación, la seguridad social, a la alimentación y al desarrollo, el salario igual por trabajo igual y los derechos de los niños. Nos oponemos a la manipulación política y el doble rasero sobre los derechos humanos. Cuba tiene mucho que decir y que mostrar en esta materia y por ello le reiteré al presidente nuestra disposición a mantener el diálogo que iniciamos. El pasado 17 de diciembre del 2014, cuando anunciamos la decisión de restablecer las relaciones diplomáticas, expresé: debemos aprender el arte de convivir de forma civilizada con nuestras diferencias. El 15 de julio del 2015, ante nuestro Parlamento, señalé: cambiar todo lo que deba ser cambiado es asunto soberano y exclusivo de los cubanos. El gobierno revolucionario tiene la disposición de avanzar en la normalización de las relaciones, convencido de que ambos países podemos cooperar y coexistir civilizadamente en beneficio mutuo, por encima de las diferencias que tenemos y seguramente tendremos, y contribuir con ello a la paz, la seguridad, la estabilidad, el desarrollo y la equidad en nuestro continente y el mundo. Hoy ratifico que debemos poner en práctica el arte de la convivencia civilizada, que implica aceptar y respetar las diferencias y no hacer de ellas el centro de nuestra relación, sino promover vínculos que privilegien el beneficio de ambos países y pueblos y concentrarnos en lo que nos acerca y no en lo que nos separa. Coincidimos en que nos queda por delante un largo y complejo camino por recorrer, pero lo importante es que hemos comenzado a dar pasos para construir una relación de nuevo tipo, como la que nunca ha existido entre Cuba y los Estados Unidos. Destruir un puente es fácil y requiere poco tiempo. Reconstruirlo sólidamente es una tarea de mucho más y larga, es mucho más larga y difícil. Después de 4 intentos fallidos, en una muestra de voluntad y perseverancia, el 2 de septiembre del 2013, la nadadora estadounidense Diana Nayat logró cruzar a nado el estrecho de la Florida sin jaula ante tiburones. Para esa hazaña de vencer la distancia que separa geográficamente a nuestros países, o por esa hazaña, el 30 de agosto del 2014, bajo los acordes de los signos nacionales de Cuba y los Estados Unidos, fue condecorada con la Orden al Mérito Deportivo otorgado por el Consejo de Estado cubano. Esta proeza contiene un fuerte mensaje. Debería servirnos de ejemplo para las relaciones bilaterales, ya que confirma que si ella pudo, entonces nosotros también podremos. Le reitero al presidente Obama nuestro agradecimiento por su visita y la voluntad del gobierno de Cuba de seguir avanzando en los próximos meses por el bien de nuestros pueblos y países. Muchas gracias.
Buenas tardes, President Castro, to you, the Cuban government, and the Cuban people. Thank you for the welcome that you've extended to me, to my family, and to my delegation. For more than half a century, the sight of a U.S. president here in Havana would have been unimaginable. But this is a new day. Es un nuevo día between our two countries. With your indulgence, Mr. President, I want to go just briefly off topic because during this weekend I received news that one of our outstanding United States Armed Service members, Marine Staff Sergeant Louis F. Cardin of Temecula, California, was killed in northern Iraq as we assisted the Iraqi government in dealing with ISIL, the terrorist organization there. And I just wanted to give my thoughts and prayers to the family there and those who've been injured. It's a reminder that even as we embark on this historic visit, there are U.S. armed service members who are sacrificing each and every day on behalf of our freedom and our safety. So I'm grateful to them. And my wife Michelle and I have brought our daughters. And by the way, they don't always want to go with us. They're teenagers now. They have friends at home and they have things to do, but they wanted to come to Cuba because they understood and we wanted to show them the beauty of Cuba and its people. We were moved by the Cubans who received us yesterday, smiling and waving as we drove in from the airport. We were grateful for the opportunity to experience Old Havana and some excellent Cuban food. Our visit to the cathedral was a reminder of the values that we share, the deep faith that sustains so many Cubans and Americans, and it also gave me an opportunity to express my gratitude to Cardinal Ortega, who, along with His Holiness Pope Francis, did so much to support the improved relations between our governments. This morning I was honored to pay tribute to Jose Marti, not only his role in Cuban independence, but the profound words that he wrote and spoke in support of liberty and freedom everywhere. I bring with me the greetings and the friendship of the American people. In fact, I'm joined on this trip by nearly 40 members of Congress, Democrats and Republicans. This is the largest such delegation of my presidency, and it indicates the excitement and interest in America about the process that we've undertaken. These members of Congress recognize that our new relationship with the Cuban people is in the interest of both nations. I'm also joined by some of America's top business leaders and entrepreneurs because we're ready to pursue more commercial ties which create jobs and opportunity for Cubans and Americans alike. And I'm especially pleased that I'm joined on this trip by so many Cuban Americans. For them and for the more than 2 million proud Cuban Americans across the United States, this is a moment filled with great emotion. Ever since we made it easier to travel between our countries, more Cuban Americans are coming home. And for many, this is a time of new hope for the future. So, President Castro, I want to thank you for the courtesy and the spirit of openness that you've shown during our talks. At our meeting in Panama last year, you said that we're willing to discuss every issue and everything's on the table. So with your understanding, my statement will be a little longer than usual. President Castro always jokes with me about how long Castro brother speeches can be, but I'm going to actually go a little longer than you probably today, with your indulgence. We have a half a century of work to catch up on. Our growing engagement with Cuba is guided by one overarching goal: advancing the mutual interests of our two countries, including improving the lives of our people, both Cubans and Americans. That's why I'm here. I've said consistently, after more than 5 very difficult decades, the relationship between our governments will not be transformed overnight. We continue, as President Castro indicated, to have some very serious differences, including on democracy and human rights. And President Castro and I have had very frank and candid conversations on these subjects. The United States recognizes progress that Cuba has made as a nation, its enormous achievements in education and in healthcare. And perhaps most importantly, I affirm that Cuba's destiny will not be decided by the United States or any other nation. Cuba is sovereign and rightly has great pride, and the future of Cuba will be decided by Cubans, not by anybody else. At the same time, as we do wherever we go around the world, I made it clear that the United States will continue to speak up on behalf of democracy, including the right of the Cuban people to decide their own future, will speak out on behalf of universal human rights, including freedom of speech and assembly and religion. Indeed, I look forward to meeting with and hearing from Cuban civil society leaders tomorrow. But as you heard, President Castro has also addressed what he views as shortcomings in the United States around basic needs for people and poverty and inequality and race relations. And we welcome that constructive dialogue as well, because we believe that when we share our deepest beliefs and ideas with an attitude of mutual respect, that we can both learn and make the lives of our people better. Now, part of normalizing relations means that we discuss these differences directly. So I'm very pleased that we've agreed to hold our next U.S.-Cuba human rights dialogue here in Havana this year. And both of our countries will welcome visits by independent United Nations experts as we combat human trafficking, which we agree is a profound violation of human rights. Even as we discuss these differences, we share a belief that we can continue to make progress in those areas that we have in common. President Castro, you said in Panama that we might disagree on something today on which we would agree tomorrow. And that's certainly been the case over the past 15 months and the days leading up to this visit. And today I can report that we continue to move forward on many fronts when it comes to normalizing relations. We're moving ahead with more opportunities for Americans to travel to Cuba and interact with the Cuban people. Over the past year, the number of Americans coming here has surged. Last week, we gave approval for individual Americans to come here for educational travel. U.S. airlines will begin direct commercial flights this year. With last week's port security announcement, we've removed the last major hurdle to resuming cruises and ferry service, all of which will mean even more Americans visiting Cuba in the years ahead and appreciating the incredible history and culture of the Cuban people. We're moving ahead with more trade. With only 90 miles between us, we're natural trading partners. Other steps we took last week, allowing the U.S. dollar to be used more widely with Cuba, giving Cubans more access to the dollar in international transactions, and allowing Cubans in the U.S. to earn salaries. These things will do more to create opportunities for trade and joint ventures. We welcome Cuba's important announcement that it plans to end the 10% penalty on dollar conversions here, which will open the door to more travel and more commerce. And these steps show that we're opening up to one another. With this visit, we've agreed to deepen our cooperation on agriculture to support our farmers and our ranchers. This afternoon, I'll highlight some of the new commercial deals being announced by major U.S. companies. And just as I continue to call on Congress to lift the trade embargo, I discussed with President Castro the steps we urge Cuba to take to show that it's ready to do more business, which includes allowing more joint ventures and allowing foreign companies to hire Cubans directly. We're moving ahead with our efforts to help connect more Cubans to the internet and the global economy. Under President Castro, Cuba's set a goal of bringing Cubans online, and we want to help. At this afternoon's entrepreneurship event, I'll discuss additional steps we're taking to help more Cubans learn, innovate, and do business online, because in the 21st century, countries cannot be successful unless their citizens have access to the internet. We're moving ahead with more educational exchanges. Thanks to the generous support of the Cuban-American community, I can announce that my 100,000 Strong in the Americas initiative will offer new opportunities for university students to study abroad, more Americans at Cuban schools and more Cubans at U.S. schools. And going forward, educational grants and scholarships will be available to Cuban students. And in partnership with the Cuban government, we'll offer more English language training for Cuban teachers, both in Cuba and online. Even as Cubans prepare for the arrival of the Rolling Stones, we're moving ahead with more events and exchanges that bring Cubans and Americans together as well. We all look forward to tomorrow's matchup between the Tampa Bay Rays and the Cuban national team. More broadly, we're moving ahead with partnerships in health, science, and the environment. Just as Cubans and American medical teams have worked together in Haiti against cholera and in West Africa against Ebola, and I want to give a special commendation to Cuban doctors who volunteered and took on some very tough assignments to save lives in West Africa in partnership with us and other nations. We very much appreciate the work that they did. Our medical professionals will now collaborate in new areas, preventing the spread of viruses like Zika and leading new research into cancer vaccines. Our governments will also work together to protect the beautiful waters of this region that we share. And as two countries threatened by climate change, I believe we can work together to protect communities and our low-lying coasts. And we're inviting Cuba to join us and our Caribbean and Central American partners at this spring's Regional Energy Summit in Washington. And finally, we're moving ahead with our closer cooperation on regional security. We're working to deepen our law enforcement coordination, especially against narco-traffickers that threaten both of our peoples. I want to thank President Castro and the Cuban government for hosting peace talks between the Colombian government and the FARC, and we remain optimistic that Colombians can achieve a lasting and just peace. And although we did not have an extensive discussion of Venezuela, we did touch on the subject, and I believe that the whole region has an interest in a country that is addressing its economic challenges, is responsive to the aspirations of its people, and is a source of stability in the region. That is, I believe, an interest that we should all share. So again, President Castro, I want to thank you for welcoming me. I think it's fair to say that the United States and Cuba are now engaged across more areas than any time during my lifetime. And with every passing day, more Americans are coming to Cuba, more U.S. businesses and schools and faith groups are working to forge new partnerships with the Cuban people. More Cubans are benefiting from the opportunities that this travel and trade bring. As you indicated, the road ahead will not be easy. Fortunately, we don't have to swim with sharks in order to achieve the goals that you and I have set forth. As you say here in Cuba, echar para delante. Despite the difficulties, we will continue to move forward. We're focused on the future, and I'm absolutely confident that if we stay on this course, we can deliver a better and brighter future for both the Cuban people and the American people. So, muchas gracias. Thank you very much.
Pasamos ahora a una breve sesión de preguntas y respuestas. Ruego a los periodistas identificarse y hacer uso de los micrófonos ubicados en la sala. Una primera pregunta del presidente Barack Obama. Sí.
First question, Jim Costa.
Gracias, President Castro, para su hospitalidad en La Habana. And thank you, Mr. President. In your meeting with President Castro, what words did you use to urge him to pursue democratic reforms and expand human rights here in Cuba? Will you invite President Castro to the White House? We know he's been to New York. And why did you not meet with Fidel Castro? And President Castro, mi padre es cubano. Él se fue para los Estados Unidos cuando era joven. My father's Cuban. He left for the United States when he was young. Ve una dirección nueva y democrática para su país. Do you see a new and democratic direction for your country? Y, por favor, señor, ¿por qué tiene prisioneros políticos cubanos? Why do you have Cuban political prisoners? ¿Y por qué no los suelta? Y, por favor, una pregunta más. ¿A quién prefiere? Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump? Gracias.
As I think we both indicated, we had a very frank conversation around issues of democracy and human rights. Our starting point is that we have two different systems of government, two different economies, and we have decades of profound differences. both bilaterally and internationally. What I have said to President Castro is that we are moving forward and not looking backwards, that we don't view Cuba as a threat to the United States. I hope that my visit here indicates the degree to which we're setting a new chapter in Cuban-American relations. But as is true with countries around the world where we have normalized relations, we will continue to stand up for basic principles that we believe in. America believes in democracy. We believe that freedom of speech and freedom of assembly and freedom of religion are not just American values, but are universal values. They may not express themselves exactly in the same way in every country. They may not be enshrined in the founding documents or constitutions of every country the same way or protected legally in exactly the same ways, but the impulse, the human impulse towards freedom, the freedom that Jose Marti talked about, we think is a universal longing. President Castro, I think, has pointed out that in his view, making sure that everybody's getting a decent education or health care, has basic security in old age, that those things are human rights as well. I personally would not disagree with that. But it doesn't detract from some of these other concerns. And the goal of the human rights dialogue is not for the United States to dictate to Cuba how they should govern themselves, but to make sure that we are having a frank and candid conversation around this issue, and hopefully that we can learn from each other. It does not mean that it has to be the only issue we talk about. Economics, health, scientific exchanges, international cooperation on issues of regional as well as global import are also important. But this is something that we are going to stay on. I actually welcome President Castro commenting on some of the areas where he feels that we're falling short, because I think we should not be immune or afraid of criticism or discussion as well. Here's the one thing I do know, is that when I talk to Cuban Americans, and Jim, you're second generation, and so I think I speak not for you directly, but for many that I talk to around the United States. I think there's enormous hope that there can be reconciliation, and the bridge that President Castro discussed can be built between the Cuban American community and Cubans here. There are family ties and cultural ties that are so strong, and I think everyone would benefit from those ties being reestablished. One of the impediments to strengthening those ties is these disagreements around human rights and democracy. And to the extent that we can have a good conversation about that and to actually make progress, that I think will allow us to see the full flowering of a relationship that is possible. In the absence of that, I think it will continue to be a very powerful irritant. This is not unique to U.S.-Cuban relations. It's one that, as you know, I have conversations with when we go to bilateral meetings with some of our very close allies, as well as countries that we don't have as close of a relationship to. But I think it is something that, that matters. And I've met with people who've been subject to arbitrary detention, and that's something that I generally have to speak out on because I hear from them directly and I know what it means for them. Go ahead.
No, chico, pero
Excuse me.
Me preguntó por preso. ¿Ya?
Yeah, what?
Estaba preguntando si se dirigió a mí porque las primeras palabras no le entendí. Me pareció oír que habló de presos humanos.
No, I think the second one was addressed to you.
Ah, preso.
And Trump and Hillary.
¿A quién? ¿A él o a mí?
Para él, para su, señor presidente Castro.
¿Qué dijo de los presos políticos? ¿Qué pregunta
qué?
concreta hizo de los presos políticos?
Sí, sí.
Si hay presos políticos. Preguntó si hay presos
¿Por qué su
políticos.
país tiene prisioneros políticos cubanos?
Está bien,
¿Y
es la
por
única
qué
que
no
te
lo
voy a
suelta?
permitir. Dame la lista ahora mismo de los presos políticos para soltarlo. Menciónala ahora. ¿Qué preso político? Dime el nombre o los nombres. O cuando concluya la reunión me da una lista con los presos. Y si hay esos presos políticos, antes de que llegue la noche van a estar sueltos. Ya.
Una
Otra pregunta.
pregunta.
¿Y Donald
Una-
Trump o Hillary Clinton, presidente Castro?
Una pregunta al presidente Raúl. Boris.
Saludos para el presidente Obama y para el
Yo
presidente.
todavía no puedo votar en los Estados Unidos. ¿Cómo?
Una pregunta para el presidente Raúl Castro, Boris Fuentes, de la televisión cubana. Presidente Raúl Castro, usted ha dicho en reiteradas ocasiones, y hoy lo ha repetido una vez más aquí, debemos aprender a convivir civilizadamente con nuestras diferencias. ¿Podría usted ampliarnos ese concepto en este momento histórico que está viviendo Cuba? Y también, de paso, una pregunta pequeña para el presidente Barack Obama. Presidente Obama, ¿podría el gobierno de Estados Unidos dar mayores pasos para eliminar el bloqueo de Estados Unidos durante su gobierno y no tendría que vivir una generación más de cubanos bajo este bloqueo económico y financiero contra Cuba?
Para mí fue la primera. O sea, repite tu pregunta que no pudo ir bien. Pues.
Usted ha dicho en reiteradas ocasiones, hoy lo ha repetido otra vez, debemos aprender a convivir civilizadamente con nuestras diferencias.
Bien, el propio presidente Obama se ha estado refiriéndose a eso. Hemos dado los primeros pasos, bastante para ser los primeros, y debemos continuar dando esos pasos. Y estoy seguro de que lograremos convivir pacíficamente en un ambiente de colaboración mutua, como ya lo estamos haciendo en algunos aspectos, en beneficio de ambos países, en beneficio de otros países, como ya lo hemos hecho modestamente en Haití, cuando el cólera, y en África con el ébola, como él se refirió. Y que es el futuro de la humanidad si queremos salvar la especie, aunque el agua siga creciendo y la isla se reduzca. Sí. Muchas preguntas para mí. Yo creo que las preguntas hay que hacerse al presidente Obama.
Presidente Obama, por favor.
Ahí está el
Yeah,
regulador.
I've got one more. So we have administratively already made a number of modifications on the embargo. I referred to a number of them in my opening statement. And we've actually been fairly aggressive in exercising as much flexibility as we can, given that the law putting the embargo in place has not been repealed by Congress. There may be some technical aspects of the embargo that we can still make adjustments on, depending on problems as they arise. So, for example, the issue around the dollar and the need to make modifications in terms of how the embargo was implemented to encourage rather than discourage reforms that the Cuban government itself is willing to engage in and to facilitate greater trade and commerce. That is something that grew out of the dialogue between our governments, and we have made appropriate adjustments to it. It will take some time for commercial banks to understand the new rules, but we actually think that this is an area where we can improve current circumstances. But I'll be honest with you that the list of things that we can do administratively is growing shorter, and the bulk of changes that have to be made with respect to the embargo are now going to rely on Congress making changes. I've been very clear about the interest in getting that done before I leave. Frankly, Congress is not as productive as I would like during presidential election years. But the fact that we have such a large congressional delegation with Democrats and Republicans with us is an indication that there is growing interest inside of Congress for lifting the embargo. As I just indicated in my earlier answer, how quickly that happens will in part depend on whether we can bridge some of our differences around human rights issues, and that's why the dialogue, I think, is so important. It sends a signal that at least there's engagement between the two countries on these matters. Okay. Now, I promised the President I would take one more question. Andrea Mitchell of NBC. Andrea, if you can get the mic.
Thank you, Mr. President. Do you feel after your meetings today that you have made enough progress to even accelerate the pace, and that the Cuban government is able to move quickly enough so that the changes that you have made through these technical adjustments to the embargo will be permanent, cannot be reversed by the next president? And what advice have you given to President Castro about the ability of having the blockade, the embargo lifted? Because he has said again today, this is a continuous issue which is blocking progress from their standpoint. And you said the conversations about human rights were frank and candid, and that you want to move forward. But even as you were arriving, there were dramatic arrests of peaceful protests, the ladies in white. What signal does that send? Can you have civilized coexistence at the same time you have such profound disagreements about the very definitions of what human rights means, as President Castro expressed today? And for President Castro, for many of us, it's remarkable to hear you speak about all of these subjects. Could you tell us what you see in the future? President Obama has 9 months remaining. You have said you would be stepping down in 2018. What is the future of our two countries, given the different definitions and the different interpretations of profound issues like democracy and human rights? Thank you.
Well, Andrea, the embargo is going to end. When? I can't be entirely sure, but I believe it will end, and the path that we're on will continue beyond my administration. The reason is logic. The reason is that what we did for 50 years did not serve our interests or the interests of the Cuban people. And as I said when we made the announcement about normalization of relations, if you keep on doing something over and over again for 50 years and it doesn't work, it might make sense to try something new. And that's what we've done. And the fact that there has been strong support, not just inside of Congress, not just among the American people, but also among the Cuban people, indicates that this is a process that should and will continue. Having said that, lifting the embargo requires the votes of a majority in Congress and maybe even more than a majority in the Senate. And as I indicated to President Castro, two things I think will help accelerate the pace of bringing the embargo to an end. The first is, to the degree that we can take advantage of the existing changes that we've already made and we see progress, that will help to validate this change in policy. So, for example, we have said that it is no longer a restriction on U.S. companies to invest in helping to build internet and broadband infrastructure inside of Cuba. It is not against U.S. law, as it's been interpreted by the administration. If we start seeing those kinds of commercial deals taking place, and Cubans are benefiting from greater access to the internet, and when I go to the entrepreneurship meeting later this afternoon, I understand that we're going to meet some young Cubans who are already getting trained and are facile and using the internet and interested in startups. That builds a constituency for ending the embargo. If we build on the work that we're doing in agriculture, and you start seeing more U.S. farmers interacting with Cuban farmers, and there's more exports and imports, that builds a constituency, and the possibility of ending the embargo increases. So hopefully taking advantage of what we've already done will help. And the second area, which we've already discussed extensively, is the issue of human rights. People are still concerned about that inside of Cuba. Now, keep in mind, I've got fierce disagreements with the Chinese around human rights. I'll be going to Vietnam later this year. I have deep disagreements with them as well. You know, when we first visited Burma, people questioned whether we should be traveling there because of long-standing human rights violations in our view. And the approach that I've taken has been that if I engage, frankly, clearly, stating what our beliefs are, but also being clear that we can't force change on any particular country. Ultimately, it has to come from within. Then that is going to be a more useful strategy than the same kinds of rigid disengagement that for 50 years did nothing. I guess ultimately what this comes down to, Andreas, I have faith in people. I think that if you meet Cubans here and Cubans meet Americans and they're meeting and talking and interacting and doing business together and going to school together and learning from each other, then they'll recognize people are people. And in that context, I believe that change will occur.
President Castro.
Okay, now I'm done, but Senor Presidente, I think Andrea had a question for you just about your vision. It's up to you. He did say he was only going to take one question, and I was going to take two, but I leave it up to you if you want to address that question.
Por favor.
Andrea's, she's one of our most esteemed journalists in America, and I'm sure she'd appreciate just a short, brief answer.
Andrea.
Mr. President.
Sí, cómo no. El otro día le hizo una pregunta al canciller nuestro. Andrea. Le están preguntando a usted, pero tenemos que concluir. Hay un programa. Yo sé que si me quedo aquí hacen 500 preguntas. Yo dije que iba a contestar una. Voy a contestar 1:30. Ya el presidente Obama me ayudó con la respuesta. Andrea, es usted. Bien, Andrea. Yo leí algo aquí de lo que pienso de los derechos humanos, pero ahora soy yo el que le voy a hacer una pregunta a usted. En las instituciones ya reconocidas hay 40 y cuánto, 40 de 61 sí. Instrumentos internacionales, etcétera. ¿Cuántos países, Andrea, del mundo cumplen los 61 derechos humanos? Eso es señalado ahí. Y civiles, en su conjunto. ¿Qué país los cumple todos? ¿Lo sabe usted? Yo sí. Ninguno. Ninguno. Unos cumplen unos, otros cumplen otros. Y entre esos estamos nosotros. De esos mencionados 61 son. Cuba cumple 47. Habrá otros que cumplan más y muchos que cumplen menos. No se puede politizar el tema de los derechos humanos. Eso no es correcto. Si se persigue con esos fines, vamos a seguir con lo mismo. Por ejemplo, para Cuba, que no los cumple todos, el derecho a la salud. ¿Usted quiere un derecho más sagrado que el derecho a la salud? Que no se mueran millones y millones de niños por falta de una simple vacuna, por cualquier medicina. Por ejemplo, ¿usted está de acuerdo con el derecho a la enseñanza gratuita para todos los nacidos en cualquier país? Creo que hay muchos países que no consideran eso un derecho humano. En Cuba, empezando que todos los niños nacen en hospital y ese mismo primer día son inscritos. Porque cuando las madres están en un estado avanzado de su embarazo, se les conduce a los hospitales muchos días antes, o en algunas casas o locales adjuntos, muchos días antes del parto, para que todos nazcan en hospitales, no importa en qué isla la montaña viva, ni sus condiciones económicas. Tenemos también otros muchos derechos. Derecho a la salud, derecho a la enseñanza. Usted considera, por ejemplo, el último ejemplo que le voy a sacar, o le voy a exponer. ¿Usted cree que por un trabajo igual un hombre gane más que una mujer solo por ser mujer? Bueno, pues en Cuba la mujer gana igual que el hombre, se hace igual trabajo. Le puedo enumerar decenas y cientos, es decir, que no se puede estar utilizando ese argumento, pienso yo, en la confrontación política, que no es justo, no es correcto. No quiero decir que no es honesto, eso forma parte de las confrontaciones. Vamos a trabajar para que todos podamos cumplir todos los derechos humanos. Eso es así. Igual que hablar de precios. Yo voy a terminar porque fue un compromiso de terminar puntual. No es correcto por preguntarnos por presos políticos. Dígame el nombre del preso político. Y ya.
Hemos concluido. Muchas gracias a todos por la participación.
Breaking tonight, Mr. Obama's legacy is on the line, along with the future for millions who are living in the United States illegally, as a divided Supreme Court now wrestles with immigration and the power of the President of the United States. Welcome to the Kelly File, everyone. I'm Megyn Kelly. There is new fallout tonight from an historic day at the United States Supreme Court and a case that offers the justices a chance to define the power of the presidency. The 8 justices heard arguments today from lawyers for some 26 states and the House of Representatives, who say President Obama effectively trampled on the Constitution when he issued his executive action on U.S. immigration policies. With the stakes running high, thousands of protesters on both sides of the argument descended on the hearings today. Despite the fact that more than half of the states in the nation are arguing against them, we have confirmed that there was a large contingent of illegal immigrants both outside and inside of today's hearings. We'll hear from one of those protesters, Jose Antonio Vargas, who was inside the High Court today in just moments, before Judge Leandro Napolitano explains why he thinks the administration and some of the more liberal justices were trying to lead the court's Chief Justice into a trap. But first, Shannon Bream explains exactly what went down today. Shannon?
Well, Megyn, the court does appear split after tough arguments today over whether the president overstepped his constitutional boundaries when he announced programs that essentially block the deportation of roughly 4 million people who are in the U.S. illegally. Thousands packed the street and the plaza outside the court today, the two sides sometimes escalating into shouting matches. One side, of course, arguing the president acted because Congress wouldn't, while the other side said that has no bearing on whether any president is allowed to step outside his or her enumerated powers. Inside, the justices both sides with tough questions. And the man who is often the swing vote, Justice Kennedy, expressed skepticism about the way this all played out, saying, quote, "The briefs go on for pages to the effect that the president has admitted a certain number of people and then Congress approves it. That seems to me to have it backwards. It's as if that the president is setting the policy and the Congress is executing it. That's just upside down." Supporters of the president's actions say they are backed by both authority and necessity. That Congress has given the president the discretion to set priorities for who goes and who stays. And noting the discrepancy between the number of those here illegally and the actual funding provided for deportations, today Justice Ginsburg said, quote, "Inevitably, priorities have to be set." And with just 8 justices, we are once again facing the possibility of a tie. If that happens, of course, the lower court ruling remains in place. And in this case, the lower court put the president's programs on hold. So supporters of them have to hope they convinced at least 5 justices today. Megyn.
Shannon, thank you. Well, as we mentioned, a number of undocumented individuals were both protesting and attending today's hearing, including our next guest, Jose Antonio Vargas. But Jose was not alone. He was joined by a 6-year-old girl, Sophie Cruz, who has become a symbol for this issue after asking Pope Francis to make sure her parents were not deported during his recent visit to Washington. Jose Antonio Vargas is editor of #EmergingUS and founder of DefineAmerican.com. Great to see you, Jose. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
So you actually said that this was one of your proudest moments as an aspiring American today. Explain that.
Well, I have to say, my mother sent me here when I was 12. Can you imagine a mom putting her son on a plane and say, "I'll see you later. A better future, is in the U.S. and not in the Philippines." My mom made a tremendous sacrifice to do that. Right? That was almost 23 years ago. So to think that that 12-year-old kid was inside the Supreme courtroom today. It still kind of boggles my mind. I have to say, it was probably the greatest honor of my life here in America was being inside that court and hearing the justices really debate this with a kind of intellectual rigor that is missing from the conversation about immigration from Donald Trump and Ted Cruz, for example. And I was seated next to Sophie Cruz the whole time, 6-year-old girl. Both of her parents are undocumented. She's a U.S. citizen. And if this executive action doesn't go through, what's going to happen to her parents? And if they get deported, if the parents get deported, what happens to the 6-year-old girl? It was really interesting, actually, because we were there for like 2 hours. borders. And so she was starting to write the names of the justices on her little notepad. And she said to me, so how many votes do we need? And I said, well, we don't want it to be a tie. So like a 5, you know.
It can't be a tie.
It can't be a tie.
Yeah, it can't be a tie for your side. I want to ask you, Jose, because you know what the argument is in part on the other side, which is without borders, we don't have a country. And if
I get all, absolutely.
And the second piece of it is, what about all of those people who want to come and live in America, who have waited, quote, in line, who didn't break the laws and want to do it right? Are they getting the short end if this executive action goes through?
So let's answer both of those points. One, absolutely a country has a right to define and defend its borders, right? I respect that, and I respect it so much that I outed myself as undocumented and said, okay, I'm here, been here since I was 12, what do you want to do with me? Well, Congress hasn't figured out what it wants to do with us. President Obama has deported more than 2.5 million of us. So then what? What do we do? And absolutely, I respect anybody who's waiting in line to come here legally. I would be more than happy to wait in line. You want me to wait 15 years, 20 years to be an American? Absolutely, I'll wait. But there has to be a process. And right now, there's no process.
Fascinating. Jose, thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Joining me now with more, Fox News senior judicial analyst Judge Andrew Napolitano, author of The Radical Expansion of Presidential Powers and the Lethal Threat to American Liberty. Judge, good to see you.
Likewise, Megan.
You know, he's right about sitting in that U.S. Supreme Court, which I did for 3 years covering the High Court. And,
right.
You know, I practice law, and I know obviously you're a judge. Let's just start on a good point, which is the amazing process by which we decide certain things in this country and the dignity with which we hash out our disputes compared to other countries that we see.
Well, Jose saw today an extremely dignified oral argument. Whatever side of this you're on, the 8 members of the Supreme Court devour the legal briefs and come in there fully equipped, with the exception of Justice Thomas, who prefers not to ask questions. They come in there fully equipped to challenge the lawyers, and by the manner in which they challenge the lawyers, they are challenging the other members of the court.
That's right. They're trying to convince the other justices. Question, why do you think some were trying to set a trap for the Chief Justice?
There really were 2 oral arguments today. I mean, there was one, but there were 2 parts to it. In the first part, it was very much 4 against 4. The 4 conservatives who I think were prepared to vote that the president doesn't have the authority to do this. No matter how it tugs at the heartstrings, Jose's story is a very, very sympathetic one. He's a unique individual. He's more American than he is Filipino, if I can say that, having spent most of his life here. And the 4 liberal justices saying the president did the right thing. He has the authority, and Congress has given him the authority. Then Justice Kagan said to the Solicitor General,
that's an Obama appointee,
and the government's lawyer, is there a way we could salvage the president's executive orders by tweaking some language here and there? And she said that knowing that the Chief Justice likes questions like that. He likes being creative, and he likes to be able to salvage things. And he went along with it, forgetting this is not a statute, this is not a law written by Congress that is presumed constitutional. This is the president making up a law. It is presumed unconstitutional. It is not their job to try and salvage it.
So we might wind up with a law, something that has the effect of a law that Congress never approved, that the president drafted, that the U.S. Supreme Court tweaked.
Because John Roberts thinks it's the right thing to try and...
Tell me, it's whether the president had the power to do this. And if they're divided 4-4, then Texas and the 26 states win, because they went in there with a win, and the president's executive action would fail.
Correct.
But they seem to be finding a way to get out of this on a technicality to say, you know what, you states, you don't even have a standing to be here. Do you think it's likely they're going to kick this case out by saying, we can't even hear this because you plaintiffs don't have the right to be here? And if so, what happens?
I don't think that's going to happen, because the Chief Justice himself said you obviously have standing. You're being forced to give driver's licenses and spend money for people that you haven't budgeted. That's enough harm to give you standing, the right to sue, standing, which the Constitution requires.
He needs more than himself to reach that conclusion.
I think it's 4-4 on whether the president exceeded his authority, and it's 4-4 on whether they're standing. The question is, does the Chief Justice do some cockamamie thing like he did with the Affordable Care Act, in order to try and save this. If he does not, and it stays at 4-4, then this dies. The president will have a field day as to what he can do in the next 8 months remaining of his term.
The Attorney General from Texas told me on Friday that if Texas loses this case and President Obama wins, it'll go back down to Texas for a trial. So he thinks there'll be another bite at the apple, but I guess it depends on exactly what they say. Always a pleasure, sir.
Thank you.
Having a little patriotic moment there, thinking about the U.S. Supreme Court. It really is something everybody should do in the course of their lifetime. Go in there and sit and listen to an argument. You will be proud of the way our system works. This is like a couple. It's not like it's got a little kinks here and there in the system, but overall, we're doing all right there. Well, with only a little more than 8 hours from the first polls opening here in New York State, early indications suggest it could be a very good night for Donald Trump. But there's a bigger issue for Republicans on the horizon, and we'll tackle that when Rudy Giuliani joins us next. Plus, we're going to detail why Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders have now split with President Obama over who may really be responsible for the 9/11 terror attacks. Dr. Sebastian Gorka is here with his take on the president, and Mark Thiessen is here on the politics. And then a 19-year-old girl named Leslie Van Houten helped Charles Manson slaughter innocent people in a crime so horrifying it is still making headlines almost 50 years later. Now she may go free. The sister of Manson's victim, Sharon Tate, is here tonight to detail why she thinks this woman could kill again. Don't go away.
Four of the Manson maniacs drove up secluded Cielo Drive in an old Ford. One of them, Tex Watson, got out and he climbed a telephone pole. He severed the wires. Already it started to sound like a horror movie. They climbed over this embankment and swarmed into the Tate household with commando-like precision and proceeded to rewrite criminal history in blood.
Breaking tonight with a little more than 8 hours now until the polls open here in New York. Donald Trump looking to hold on to his home state and earn, at a minimum, a majority of the 95 delegates at stake. Right now, his odds look very good. The latest Real Clear Politics average shows Trump with a commanding lead over Ted Cruz and John Kasich. You can see Cruz coming in third, according to those polls in this state. But that's just part of the story of tonight's big political action. In moments, we'll be joined by former New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani, and we will ask him about his decision to support Donald Trump. But we begin with our chief political correspondent, campaign Carl Cameron, reporting from Buffalo, New York, where Trump just wrapped up a rally. Carl?
And it was a raucous one, Megan. Good evening. We're here at the First Niagara Center, home of the Buffalo Sabres, the NHL team here. And Mr. Trump put in over 11,000 people in a capacity of 19,000 arena, and it was a very raucous rally. He has good reason to be excited. He's looking for a sweep or the vast majority of the 95 delegates up for grabs in New York's primary tomorrow night. To do that, he'll have to get a majority statewide and then a majority in each of the state's congressional districts. If he falls short of a majority, less than 50%, then they would become proportional, and that would be a significant setback for Trump. But his goal is to get about 80 delegates, and they're very confident of that. And this evening, he gave Ted Cruz a big slapdown. Listen.
Here's a man that turned down Sandy money for this state and plenty of other money. We had lots of things coming into New York, and he voted against. No New Yorker can vote for Ted Cruz.
The latest polls from NBC Wall Street Journal shows that Trump now has crested 50% in New York and has more support in that poll than both Cruz and Kasich combined. Cruz was holding nothing back today. He's been arguing for several months now that this is likely to go to a contested convention, and he said today that there will be a battle in Cleveland, signaling that he intends to fight all the way there. And as for John Kasich, Trump gave him a bit of a whack too today, saying he's only won one of the 34 contests thus far, and yet Kasich says he's going all the way to the convention too. His argument, Megan, is that regardless of the delegates, by the time the Republican Party gets to Cleveland for that convention in July, they'll recognize that Cruz and Trump are not the candidates to go up against Hillary Clinton, and that Kasich, who's been both a governor and congressman, is. Megan?
Carl, thank you. Heading into New York, Donald Trump is enjoying a substantial lead in the overall delegate count, nearly 200 ahead of Texas Senator Ted Cruz, leaving Ohio Governor John Kasich way behind. But when it comes to securing the delegates he will need if there's actually a contested convention and it goes to that second ballot, that is a different story. Tom Bevan is the co-founder and publisher of one of the greatest websites online, realcareerpolitics.com. It's my favorite. Great to see you, Tom. Thank you for being here. So I'll put it to you this way. Vox has a piece out today that says Trump is great at winning primaries, but bad when it comes to securing delegates needed in case of a contested convention. I mean, does that about sum it up?
It does. You know, I like to think of it this way, Megan. It's Trump is playing big ball, right? He's trying to win votes, he's trying to win states, and he's trying to accrue the delegates that are supposed to come with that. Cruz is really playing small ball, right? He is working these individual states, the sort of arcane process by which the delegates are actually selected, and he's doing a pretty good job of putting his people in those positions so that when they get to Cleveland in July, even though Trump will have a lead in the overall delegate count of which most of those folks are bound on the first ballot, Trump may actually have more folks who are loyal to him as delegates, and that's what he hopes he can do on if it goes to a second ballot.
Cruz may have more folks who are loyal to him, you're saying?
Yes, I'm sorry. Cruz may have more folks, and that's his plan.
Cruz's whole strategy is basically death by 1,000 cuts to Trump. Like, he can't knock him out with some big win, certainly in New York. He's not going to knock him out with some big win in California, according to the polls. You know, it'd be proportional awarding of the delegates. So it's little bits here, there, and everywhere.
Yeah, but I mean, look, this is how it's done. This is Cruz's argument. These are the rules. Everybody knows the rules, and he's simply playing by them. And he does have a point. And that's how he's going to, I mean, that's his only chance. He's mathematically eliminated from winning, getting to 1237 now at this point, especially after tomorrow night. And so this is his only hope, is to get to a contested convention, get to an open convention. And Trump is really, I think most people think, Megan, he's one and done. If he doesn't win it on the first ballot, it's highly unlikely that he's going to.
And what are his odds now of getting Trump's to 1237, given how well he's likely to do in New York? Of course, there's a question of Indiana, where Cruz is expected to do well, and then California, where Trump's leading, but Cruz is expected to do all right.
I mean, I think he's still got a chance. It's slimmer than it was before because of the way some of these states, Colorado played out and Wyoming. But it depends on, tomorrow night. If he does better than 80 delegates, if he gets 90, 95, he does a full sweep, and what he does in the next 2 weeks in the Northeast, he'll be in a good position. He won't have to kill it in California. If he doesn't do that well, and if he loses in Indiana, it's going to be very, very tough. He'd have to win almost every delegate in California, and that seems unlikely.
Tom, thank you.
You bet.
Crazy, right? Joining us now, Rudy Giuliani, former mayor of New York City and a man who ran for president himself back in 2008. We were just talking about who would have thought New York State would be relevant?
Who would have thought we would be coming down to New York and ultimately maybe even California to figure this out?
You heard
or
Tom
the convention.
Say the magic number for Trump is likely over 80 delegates in New York. Do you think he'll make it?
I think he'll go over 80.
Okay.
Yeah, the 53, 55 seems very solid to me. It's more of a question of how many of the congressional districts, if he go over 50. He's probably going to do it in most. So he's going to probably come out of New York with somewhere between 80 and 90 delegates.
And how do you like his chances of getting 1237 by June 7th, which is the last day of voting?
I think they exist. I mean, they don't exist for Cruz. They don't exist for Kasich. The only person they exist for is Trump. And the one thing that is for sure, Trump is going to go in with a big lead.
And with more votes. I mean, yeah, go ahead, sorry.
So the Cruz legal argument is correct. Those are the rules. I'm playing by the rules. I'm making deals behind the scenes. That's all fine. The political argument is very bad, however. We have a Republican electorate that is angry at Washington for deal making, angry at the elite, and now we're going to reject the will of the almost majority of the Republican voters. Man, that's tough.
It's dicey for the Republicans any way you slice it at this point, right? Given how divided they remain this late in the process.
Yeah, it is. It's not good. But I mean, the reality is, if you look at the polls, right, 60-70% of Republicans believe the person with the most votes should be the nominee.
Right, 64%, I think, according to the Bloomberg poll.
What you call democracy. The other is game playing. The other is the way we used to do it in the
It's holding up the rule book.
Yes, the 19th century, we sit back there with the cigars and we figure out who gets this and who gets that and who gets what position and who gets the other position. Having nominated presidents through primaries through most of the adult lives
of the people of America, this is going to seem very strange.
Right, we're not used to this. It's
really
rarely this close where we see the sausage getting made.
If some guy who is ahead by 300 votes loses to someone who's behind him by 300 votes, and a bunch of people that nobody ever met pick that guy.
Now you say you're gonna vote for Donald
Trump. Tomorrow morning I'll wake up early, I'm going to go vote for Donald. I've urged all my friends to vote for him. Think of the 3 candidates we have left in the Republican primary. He's the best candidate, and I think he is by far the best chance to beat Hillary Clinton, which is my major objective. If I thought Cruz had a better chance of beating Hillary Clinton, I'd support Cruz, and I'll tell you why. I think Cruz is a fastball that the Democrats have hit out of the park whenever they want. Straight right wing, very doctrinaire, very easy to beat, can't win any of the Northeast, can't win the West. Trump is a Mariano Rivera cut fastball.
I know a couple of these references. I know he's a closer. He's a closer.
No. You can't, he's unexpected. Hillary doesn't have a rule book for running against
Donald Trump.
She's got one for running against Cruz. She's run against Cruz before.
So why not endorse him?
Oh, only because I'm not part of the campaign. I mean, I don't want anybody to think that I am an official in the campaign. I'm part of the campaign. I take orders from the campaign.
That, right?
Okay, so I support him.
Okay. I mean, the New York Post endorsed Donald Trump. I don't think anybody thinks that the New York Post is part of the campaign.
But I'm a political person. And whenever I endorse, I go make speeches. I'm part of the campaign.
So I see. So you're just like, I don't want to travel. I'm going to go on the Kelly file. That's what I'm going to do.
If they make some of the changes I would like, maybe.
Oh.
You know, if the campaign organization were what I'd like to see.
Well, they're shoring it up now. I think they're shoring it up.
So maybe that'll come. But there's no question. I believe he is by far the best candidate. And if people want to interpret that as an endorsement, it is. But it doesn't require any obligation on my part to have to defend every single thing they do, because there are some of the things they do, like with you. Like the statement about the Mexicans, things that I don't agree with. You know, I worked for Ronald Reagan, and I agreed with Ronald Reagan 8 out of 10 times, and that was enough. Right? And I love him.
Right. And
I agree with Trump about 8 out of 10 times. And he's also been a friend for 25 years, and I trust him.
That counts for a lot. Yeah. Great to see you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here. Well, it was almost 50 years ago when Charlie Manson and his so-called family carried out one of the most horrifying crimes in American history. Now, one of the women who killed for Charlie may be about to go free. The sister of one of Manson's victims, Sharon Tate, who was 8.5 months pregnant when she was murdered, is here tonight on her fight to keep the Manson family and all of their associates behind bars. Plus, President Obama is headed to Saudi Arabia this week as the fight ramps up over the secret part of the 9/11 report and what it says about the Saudi royal family. Mark Thiessen and Dr. Sebastian Gorka are here next on that. Breaking tonight, tensions may be near a boiling point between the United States and Saudi Arabia, just 2 days ahead of President Obama's trip to the kingdom, as Democrats and Republicans alike push for the full release of the 28 pages of the 9/11 Commission report that remain classified. Charlie Rose of CBS News just asked President Obama what is in these pages tonight.
Have you read it?
You know, I have a sense of what's in there. Jim Clapper, our Director of National Intelligence, has been going through to make sure that whatever it is that is released is not going to compromise some major national security interest of the United States.
Joining us now, Mark Thiessen, Fox News contributor, former chief speechwriter to President George W. Bush, and Dr. Sebastian Gorka. He is the Major General Horner Distinguished Chair of Military Theory at the Marine Corps University and the author of the brand new book, Defeating Jihad, The Winnable War. Great to see you both. Dr. Gorka, let me start with you on this. What is your take? Because in some circles it's very controversial about whether these 28 pages should be declassified. Is it a good idea or no?
Look, when you've had, Megyn, both Republican and Democrat congressmen say that these pages should be released, and congressmen who've actually read those pages, I think the argument of the administration is lost. We need to know what was the exact involvement. There are lots of stories floating around of Saudi embassy officials assisting some of the hijackers, at least 2 of them located in San Diego. know. We need to know that. There needs to be justice for the victims of 9/11. And I think after 15 years, now could be the time to declassify these 28 pages.
Mark, if what's in the pages suggests that the Saudi government or top officials in some way were behind 9/11 or had a substantial role in 9/11, don't we need to know that, or is that something it doesn't serve us to know?
Well, I think it does serve us to know the details of it to the extent that it doesn't compromise sources and methods or hurt our national security. Two administrations, both the Bush and Obama administration, decided that they would hurt our national security. I haven't seen the 28 pages, and neither has Dr. Gorka, so we don't know what's in them exactly. But we already know that Saudi Arabia was turning a blind eye to terror and was even, in some ways, complicit in terror. I mean, Saudi Arabia was one of 3 countries on the face of the earth that recognized the Taliban regime in Afghanistan that was harboring al-Qaeda. In 2003, Vice President Cheney gave a speech, and I'll read you what he said. In Saudi Arabia, fundraisers and facilitators were providing money and logistical support to al-Qaeda. So these are things that we already know. We don't know all the details. But President Bush, what he did was he made an ultimatum to the world. He said, you are either with us or you're with the terrorists. And he gave a choice to countries like Saudi Arabia, and they choose to be with us. And they're now a very important counterterrorism partner.
So
but before 9/11, they were helping. Absolutely.
So I mean, what is the takeaway on that, Dr. Gorka? That they did help. They participated in the 9/11 attacks, but they came over to the lightness after 9/11. And now, what are we supposed to do?
Look, the reality is Saudi Arabia, like Pakistan, is a fundamentally schizophrenic nation. We know that they cut a deal with the jihadists in 1979 after the siege of Mecca. We know that elements of the regime have been supporting or funding jihadi organizations around the world.
But we need them still. We need the Saudis.
Right, but that doesn't mean as a government they're all bad guys. They're just conflicted and they're schizophrenic, and they need to get their house in order and decide whether they can clean internally their house and make sure they're on our side against the jihadists. They've been kind of half pregnant for the last 15 years,
So
Megyn.
it's like dealing with Sybil. You remember Sybil, the movie where she had all the personalities inside of her? So like the bad and then the good, and we don't know which one we're getting, but we've decided that we need to sort of pretend that it's all good because they can provide some benefit to us. But Mark, I ask you, are we gaining something at this point by keeping the 28 pages secret when Bob Graham, of the 9/11 Commission is saying, release the pages, that this classification stuff is nonsense, that the American public has a right to know who was behind the attack, and there's no reason to continue protecting them?
Well, I think that's probably true. Again, as long as it doesn't compromise sources and methods. And Bob Graham has seen the document, so he knows better than either of us as to what's in it and whether it would compromise sources and methods. But there are other people in senior positions who disagree. I can't make a judgment on that based on having not seen the document. But we do know that the 9/11 Commission found that the Saudi government, as an institution, and senior officials did not participate in the 9/11 attacks.
But that was worded very carefully.
Yeah, I know.
Very carefully. You could drive a truck through the holes in that statement.
Were there people, were there princes, were there people, you have a Saudi king who has dozens of wives and dozens of sons and dozens of grandchildren. Were there members of the Saudi royal family? Were there people who were officials who did, not as a matter of government policy, but as a matter of ideology, help the 9/11 attacks? We do need to know that, absolutely.
And so, Dr. Gorka, what's your take on where we should stand with Saudi Arabia? Because now some are pushing this bill that would allow the 9/11 family members to sue the Saudis, and the Saudis are making all sorts of threats against us if we do that they're going to pull all of their assets out of here, that they're going to hurt the United States financially. If you're looking for the number here, it's a substantial sum. I don't have it in front of me, but what do you make of their reaction?
$750 billion.
There you go.
They are threatening to sell $750 billion of U.S. assets. That's just a smokescreen. Never going to happen. That regime cannot survive without us militarily and economically. And I'd like to emphasize what you said previously, Megyn. The wording of the 9/11 Commission report is incredibly precise. The Saudi government as an institution and high-ranking members of the government were not responsible for 9/11. That is very, very telling wording.
I mean, as a lawyer, it's like...
As a lawyer, you know it.
That's on the nose. They could have done better. We get it. All right, guys, good discussion. Thank you both.
Thanks, Megyn.
Well, the Secretary of the Treasury has just reneged on a major promise he made to America. I mean, a 180. And it may not sit well with at least half of the country. We'll show you why. Plus, she was a prom queen before she became a follower of Charles Manson and went on a murder spree that shocked the nation. Now she may go free, and the sister of a Manson family victim joins us next.
I make no excuse for what I have done. My actions August 10th, 1969 were contemptible, and they were without justification.
Developing tonight, outrage from the families of Charles Manson's victims as one infamous cult member could soon walk free. Leslie Van Houten was 19 years old in the summer of 1969. That's her on the right, smiling, before her conviction into horrifying slaughters. A swastika she willingly carved into her own forehead visible. This is Leslie today, 66 years old now, and deemed eligible for parole. Joining us tonight in a cable news exclusive, Deborah Tate, sister of the late actress Sharon Tate, who was one of Manson's victims. But we begin with Trace Gallagher in Los Angeles with the latest. Trace.
Megan, supporters of Leslie Van Houten say at the time she murdered Rosemary LaBianca in 1969, she was a misguided teen under the influence of LSD and the victim of Charles Manson's mind control. Her attorney says her release is long overdue, and the state parole board cites her 46 years in prison without a single serious rule violation. Van Houten has said she is remorseful and deeply ashamed. Here she is during a 2010 hearing. Listen.
I make no excuse for what I have done. My actions August 10th, 1969 were contemptible, and they were without justification.
But the Los Angeles County District Attorney, several LaBianca family members, and many others are trying to block her release, reminding the public that Van Houten was among the so-called Manson family members who invaded the home of Leno and Rosemary LaBianca and fully participated in the gruesome double murder. During her 1971 trial, Van Houten spoke in chilling detail, saying she held down Rosemary LaBianca as her husband was being stabbed to death, and then testified how she and Patricia Kenwinkle finished the job, quoting here, "And I took one of the knives, and Patricia had one knife, and we started stabbing and cutting up the lady." Van Houten alone stabbed Rosemary LaBianca 14 times. Now LaBianca's stepdaughter says, quote, "My father will never be paroled. My stepmother will never get her life back." Van Houten's release still needs the approval of state parole board lawyers and Governor Jerry Brown. Last year, Brown refused to sign the release for another Manson family member. Megan.
Trace, thank you. Joining us now in a cable news exclusive, Deborah Tate, who was in this parole board hearing that led to the recommendation that Van Houten be deemed eligible for parole. Thank you so much for being here, Deb.
Thank you.
So your sister Sharon was brutally murdered by Manson and his so-called family. And this woman, who's now facing the likelihood of parole, was also convicted of conspiring in that murder in addition to the double murder that she participated in we just discussed there.
Absolutely correct.
You were in the hearing. How did they get to the point where they felt she should be paroled?
She has a master's degree. She's very well educated. She's used the rehabilitation program to its very best. In that way, she looks great on paper. I'm not so sure that anybody that's capable of doing things like that, that is plunging a knife deep into someone's body 14 times, can ever be rehabilitated from that. There's a mean and dark and ugly side. And mind you, she did that after knowing full well what the carnage was the night before at my sister's house.
Because they happened one day after the other.
Correct.
And she's admitted that she put a pillow over her victim's face, that she wrapped around a lamp cord, and that she heard the guttural murder of
Absolutely.
the husband in the other room, and then she went ahead and plunged the knife into her victim herself. However, you know her defense now, which is, I don't offer any excuses. I'm deeply ashamed. She says she was under the control of this madman and that she had never committed a violent crime ever before that moment.
I'm not sure I buy the under the influence of a madman. There were many Manson family members that chose not to participate in murder, creepy crawlies. That was the act of going into people's homes in the middle of the night. There were people that chose to leave the Manson family when things started turning to the dark, violent classes teaching the various family members how to use a knife in the correct way to take somebody's life. If she wanted to go, she could have gone. This is a upper middle class young woman who graduated and had a good set of skills that she could have started a life with, and her father provided a great life.
She was on LSD, and now they seem to be focused on her model behavior as a prisoner, that she's gotten a bachelor's and a master's, and she's educated other women in the prison with self-help programs. They basically say that, you know, they are buying her contrition and that she would pose no danger to the public.
What else could someone do except use their time to the best of their ability to help plea for their freedom? That's exactly what the system's designed for.
Do you think she's a danger, or is it more about punishment?
No, I absolutely believe in the bottom of my heart that this woman is fully capable of being a danger to society. If not actively taking part in that act of murder again, at least in the way that she influences young people's minds. The Manson family has more followers today than they ever did through the internet. There's an organization called ATWA, which stands for Airs, Trees, Water, and Animals. So young people join this organization thinking it's good. Peace, love, just as it was in the 60s, is the face of it. But underneath, there's an agenda, and that agenda is a race war.
Which was Charlie Manson's goal.
Absolutely.
I know you're petitioning Governor Brown to reject this parole. He did it, as Trace outlined, last year with another Manson associate. What do you feel your odds are, given that he's already rejected parole in another Manson case? Do you think that makes it more or less likely in this case?
I'm hoping and praying that he does the same thing and rejects. However, I would like to implore that the public go to NoParoleForMansonFamily.com and sign the petition to let the politicians know how we feel.
Deborah, it's great to see you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
And I asked Deborah to walk me through how she first found out about her sister's gruesome murder and where it went from there. And she did so in a chilling exchange. We've posted that at Facebook.com/The Kelly File. You can see that beginning now. And up next, James Rosen joins us on how the Secretary of the Treasury just reneged on a major promise and why a lot of women and some men may be unhappy about it. Next.
From the world headquarters of Fox News, it's The Kelly File with Megyn Kelly.
Well, a campaign to put a woman on U.S. paper currency has been in the works for some time. Previously, Treasury Secretary Jack Lew made it sound as if the $10 bill would be the first to get a makeover. But now it seems the hip-hop Broadway musical Hamilton has influenced the secretary in ways no one could have expected. Chief Washington correspondent James Rosen has more. Hey, James.
Megyn, good evening. Not since President Obama declined to enforce his red line in Syria has an American public official so visibly reneged on so highly publicized a promise as the Treasury Secretary has done in this case. Jack Lew said last June that the $10 bill would be redesigned to include the portrait of a woman alongside that of Alexander Hamilton, the founder of the New York Post, who is better known to some as the genius architect of our nation's financial system. But all that was before millions of people protested and before the Broadway musical Hamilton, a retelling of the Founding Fathers' story in hip-hop idiom, had demonstrated its box office appeal and critical acclaim. Indeed, just today, the play was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for Drama. Now, published reports say Treasury is abandoning Lew's promise to have a woman share space with Hamilton on the 10. Instead, the plan reportedly calls for the back of the $10 bill to feature a panorama of dynamic women throughout history, a move that swiftly triggered comparisons to the demand that Rosa Parks sit at the back of the bus in Montgomery Montgomery, Alabama, during the Civil Rights era. As well, Treasury is said to be looking to evict Andrew Jackson, the 7th President of the United States, from the front of the $20 bill in favor of a woman yet to be named. As all along, the frontrunners in this female race for immortalization on our currency are Rosa Parks, the civil rights icon who died in 2005, Susan B. Anthony, the suffragist whose image appeared on the dollar coin first minted in 1979, and Eleanor Roosevelt, the first lady who, following her husband's death, championed human rights and leftist causes. Even if announced later this week, as is expected, these moves will take years to enact, with the redesigned $10 bill to debut in 2020, the new 20 sometime thereafter. Megan.
So in 2020, we're going to have some $10 bills with Alexander Hamilton on the front and some woman yet to be named on the back. A collection of women, they said, will be on the back.
Right.
And so we will celebrate the 100th year anniversary of women's suffrage with a bunch of women on the back of one bill.
Yeah, you know, it's bad enough, Megan, when our leaders cave into political pressure, but it's downright contemptible when our leaders cave into Broadway pressure. I mean, Jesus Christ Superstar, you can almost see tipping the scales of justice here, the invisible jazz hands of the elites.
Where could this go next? You know, it's this little 9-year-old girl, Sophia, started this movement. She wrote, "I think putting a woman on the back of the bill would make women seem less important." You think? Great to see you, James. Always a pleasure.
Likewise. Thank you, Megan.
We'll be right back. File right here for complete coverage of the battle for New York. We will be live as the polls close here in the Empire State, and we'll have live reports and complete coverage from Brit Hume, Stuart Stevens, DNC Chairwoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz. That ought to be interesting. It was the last time. See you then.
Good morning. Everybody, please have a seat. Of the many powers and responsibilities that the Constitution vests in the presidency, few are more consequential than appointing a Supreme Court justice, particularly one to succeed Justice Scalia, one of the most influential jurists of our time. The men and women who sit on the Supreme Court are the final arbiters of American law. They safeguard our rights. They ensure that our system is one of laws and not men. They're charged with the essential task of applying principles put to paper more than 2 centuries ago to some of the most challenging questions of our time. So this is not a responsibility that I take lightly. It's a decision that requires me to set aside short-term expediency and narrow politics so as to maintain faith with our founders and perhaps more importantly with future generations. And that's why over the past several weeks I've done my best to set up a rigorous and comprehensive process. I've sought the advice of Republican and Democratic members of Congress. We've reached out to every member of the Senate Judiciary Committee, to constitutional scholars, to advocacy groups, to bar associations representing an array of interests and opinions from all across the spectrum. And today, after completing this exhaustive process, I've made my decision. I've selected a nominee who is widely recognized not only as one of America's sharpest legal minds, but someone who brings to his work a spirit of decency, modesty, integrity, even-handedness, and excellence. These qualities and his long commitment to public service have earned him the respect and admiration of leaders from both sides of the aisle. He will ultimately bring that same character to bear on the Supreme Court, an institution in which he is uniquely prepared to serve immediately. Today I am nominating Chief Judge Merrick Brian Garland to join the Supreme Court. Now, in law enforcement circles and in the legal community at large, Judge Garland needs no introduction. But I'd like to take a minute to introduce Merrick to the American people, whom he already so ably serves. He was born and raised in the land of Lincoln, in my hometown of Chicago, in my home state of Illinois. His mother volunteered in the community. His father ran a small business out of their home. Inheriting that work ethic, Merrick became valedictorian of his public high school. He earned a scholarship to Harvard, where he graduated summa cum laude. And he put himself through Harvard Law School by working as a tutor, by stocking shoes in a shoe store, and in what is always a painful moment for any young man, by selling his comic book collection. It's tough. Been there. Merrick graduated magna cum laude from Harvard Law, and the early years of his legal career bear all the traditional marks of excellence. He clerked for two of President Eisenhower's judicial appointees, first for a legendary judge on the Second Circuit, Judge Henry Friendly, and then for Supreme Court Justice William Brennan. Following his clerkships, Merrick joined a highly regarded law firm with a practice focused on litigation and pro bono representation of disadvantaged Americans. Within 4 years, he earned a partnership, the dream of most lawyers. But in 1989, just months after that achievement, Merrick made a highly unusual career decision. He walked away from a comfortable and lucrative law practice to return to public service. Merrick accepted a low-level job as a federal prosecutor in President George H.W. Bush's administration, took a 50% pay cut, traded in his elegant partner's office for a windowless closet that smelled of stale cigarette smoke. This was a time when crime here in Washington had reached epidemic proportions, and he wanted to help. And he quickly made a name for himself going after corrupt politicians and violent criminals. His sterling record as a prosecutor led him to the Justice Department, where he oversaw some of the most significant prosecutions in the 1990s, including overseeing every aspect of the federal response to the Oklahoma City bombing. In the aftermath of that act of terror, when 168 people, many of them small children, were murdered, Merrick had one evening to say goodbye to his own young daughters before he boarded a plane to Oklahoma City, and he would remain there for weeks. He worked side by side with first responders, rescue workers, local and federal law enforcement. He led the investigation and supervised the prosecution that brought Timothy McVeigh to justice. But perhaps most important is the way he did it. Throughout the process, Merrick took pains to do everything by the book. When people offered to turn over evidence voluntarily, he refused, taking the harder route of obtaining the proper subpoenas instead, because Merrick would take no chances that someone who murdered innocent Americans might go free on a technicality. Merrick also made a concerted effort to reach out to the victims and their families, updating them frequently on the case's progress. Everywhere he went, he carried with him in his briefcase the program from the memorial service with each of the victims' names inside, a constant searing reminder of why he had to succeed. Judge Garland has often referred to his work on the Oklahoma City case as, and I quote, "the most important thing I have ever done in my life." And through it all, he never lost touch with that community that he served. It's no surprise then that soon after his work in Oklahoma City, Merrick was nominated to what's often called the second highest court in the land, the D.C. Circuit Court. During that process, during that confirmation process, he earned overwhelming bipartisan praise from senators and legal experts alike. Republican Senator Orrin Hatch, who was then chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, supported his nomination. Back then he said, "In all honesty, I would like to see one person come to this floor and say one reason why Merrick Garland does not deserve this position." He actually accused fellow Senate Republicans trying to obstruct Merrick's confirmation of playing politics with judges. And he has since said that Judge Garland would be a consensus nominee for the Supreme Court, who would be very well supported by all sides, and there would be no question Merrick would be confirmed with bipartisan support. Now, ultimately, Merrick was confirmed to the D.C. Circuit, the second highest court in the land, with votes from a majority of Democrats and a majority of Republicans. 3 years ago, he was elevated to Chief Judge. And in his 19 years on the D.C. Circuit, Judge Garland has brought his trademark diligence, compassion, and unwavering regard for the rule of law to his work. On a circuit court known for strong-minded judges on both ends of the spectrum, Judge Garland has earned a track record of building consensus as a thoughtful, fair-minded judge who follows the law. He's shown a rare ability to bring together odd couples, assemble unlikely coalitions, persuade colleagues with wide-ranging judicial philosophies to sign on to his opinions. And this record on the bench speaks, I believe, to Judge Garland's fundamental temperament, his insistence that all views deserve a respectful hearing. His habit, to borrow a phrase from former Justice John Paul Stevens, of understanding before disagreeing, and then disagreeing without being disagreeable. It speaks to his ability to persuade, to respond to the concerns of others with sound arguments and airtight logic. As his former colleague on the D.C. Circuit and our current Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Roberts, once said, "Anytime Judge Garland disagrees, you know you're in a difficult area." At the same time, Chief Judge Garland is more than just a brilliant legal mind. He's someone who has a keen understanding that justice is about more than abstract legal theory, more than some footnote in a dusty casebook. His life experience, his experience in places like Oklahoma City, informs his view that the law is more than an intellectual exercise. He understands the way law affects the daily reality of people's lives in a big, complicated democracy and in rapidly changing times. And throughout his jurisprudence runs a common thread, a dedication to protecting the basic rights of every American, a conviction that in a democracy, powerful voices must not be allowed to drown out the voices of everyday Americans. To find someone with such a long career of public service, marked by complex and sensitive issues, to find someone who just about everyone not only respects but genuinely likes, that is rare. And it speaks to who Merrick Garland is, not just as a lawyer, but as a man. People respect the way he treats others, his genuine courtesy and respect for his colleagues and those who come before his court. They admire his civic-mindedness, mentoring his clerks throughout their careers, urging them to use their legal training to serve their communities, setting his own example by tutoring a young student at a Northeast D.C. elementary school each year for the past 18 years. They're moved by his deep devotion to his family. Lynn, his wife of nearly 30 years, and their two daughters, Becky and Jessie. As a family, they indulge their love of hiking and skiing and canoeing and their love of America by visiting our national parks. People respect Merrick's deep and abiding passion for protecting our most basic constitutional rights. It's a passion, I'm told, that manifested itself at an early age. And one story is indicative of this. It's notable. As valedictorian of his high school class, he had to deliver a commencement address. The other student speaker that day spoke first and unleashed a fiery critique of the Vietnam War. Fearing the controversy that might result, several parents decided to unplug the sound system, and the rest of the student's speech was muffled. And Merrick didn't necessarily agree with the tone of his classmates' remarks, nor his choice of topic for that day, but stirred by the sight of a fellow student's voice being silenced, he tossed aside his prepared remarks and delivered instead, on the spot, a passionate, impromptu defense of our First Amendment rights. It was the beginning of a lifelong career as a lawyer and a prosecutor and as a judge devoted to protecting the rights of others. And he has done that work with decency and humanity and common sense and a common touch. And I'm proud that he'll continue that work on our nation's highest court. I said I would take this process seriously, and I did. I chose a serious man and an exemplary judge, Merrick Garland. Over my 7 years as president, in all my conversations with senators from both parties, in which I asked their views on qualified Supreme Court nominees, and this includes the previous 2 seats that I had to fill, the one name that has come up repeatedly from Republicans and Democrats alike is Merrick Garland. Now, I recognize that we have entered the political season, or perhaps these days it never ends. A political season that is even noisier and more volatile than usual. I know that Republicans will point to Democrats who've made it hard for Republican presidents to get their nominees confirmed. And they're not wrong about that. There's been politics involved in nominations in the past, although it should be pointed out that in each of those instances, Democrats ultimately confirmed a nominee put forward by a Republican president. I also know that because of Justice Scalia's outsized role on the court and in American law, and the fact that Americans are closely divided on a number of issues before the court, it is tempting to make this confirmation process simply an extension of our divided politics, the squabbling that's going on in the news every day. But to go down that path would be wrong. It would be a betrayal of our best traditions and a betrayal of the vision of our founding documents. At a time when our politics are so polarized, at a time when norms and customs of political rhetoric and courtesy and comedy are so often treated like they're disposable, this is precisely the time when we should play it straight and treat the process of appointing a Supreme Court justice with the seriousness and care it deserves. Because our Supreme Court really is unique. It's supposed to be above politics. It has to be, and it should stay that way. To suggest that someone as qualified and respected as Merrick Garland doesn't even deserve a hearing, let alone an up or down vote, to join an institution as important as our Supreme Court, when 2/3 of Americans believe otherwise, that would be unprecedented. To suggest that someone who has served his country with honor and dignity, with a distinguished track record of delivering justice for the American people, might be treated, as one Republican leader stated, as a political piñata, that can't be right. Tomorrow, Judge Garland will travel to the Hill to begin meeting with senators one-on-one. I simply ask Republicans in the Senate to give him a fair hearing, and then an up or down vote. If you don't, then it will not only be an abdication of the Senate's constitutional duty, it will indicate a process for nominating and confirming judges that is beyond repair. It will mean everything is subject to the most partisan of politics. Everything. It will provoke an endless cycle of more tit for tat and make it increasingly possible for any president, Democrat or Republican, to carry out their constitutional function. The reputation of the Supreme Court will inevitably suffer. faith in our justice system will inevitably suffer. And our democracy will ultimately suffer as well. I have fulfilled my constitutional duty. Now it's time for the Senate to do theirs. Presidents do not stop working in the final year of their term. Neither should a senator. I know that tomorrow the Senate will take a break and leave town on recess for 2 weeks. My earnest hope is that senators take that time to reflect on the importance of this process to our democracy. Not what's expedient, not what's happening at the moment. What does this mean for our institutions, for our common life? The stakes, the consequences, the seriousness of the job we all swore an oath to do. And when they return, I hope that they'll act in a bipartisan fashion. I hope they're fair. That's all. I hope they are fair, as they did when they confirmed Merrick Garland to the D.C. Circuit. I ask that they confirm Merrick Garland now to the Supreme Court so that he can take his seat in time to fully participate in its work for the American people this fall. He is the right man for the job. He deserves to be confirmed. I could not be prouder of the work that he has already done on behalf of the American people. He deserves our thanks, and he deserves a fair hearing. And with that, I'd like to invite Judge Garland to say a few words. Thank you. You're good at me.
Thank you, Mr. President. This is the greatest honor of my life, other than Lynn agreeing to marry me 28 years ago. It's also the greatest gift I've ever received, except, and there's another caveat, the birth of our daughters, Jessie and Becky. As my parents taught me, by both words and deeds, a life of public service is as much a gift to the person who serves as it is to those he is serving. And for me, there could be no higher public service than serving as a member of the United States Supreme Court. My family deserves much of the credit for the path that led me here. My grandparents left the Pale of Settlement at the border of Western Russia and Eastern Europe in the early 1900s, fleeing anti-Semitism and hoping to make a better life for their children in America. They settled in the Midwest, eventually making their way to Chicago. There, my father, who ran the smallest of small businesses from a room in our basement, took me with him as he made the rounds to his customers, always impressing upon me the importance of hard work and fair dealing. There, my mother headed the local PTA and school board and directed a volunteer services agency, all the while instilling in my sisters and me the understanding that service to the community is a responsibility above all others. Even now, my sisters honor that example by serving the children of their communities. I know that my mother is watching this on television and crying her eyes out. So are my sisters, who have supported me in every step I have ever taken. I only wish that my father were here to see this today. I also wish that we hadn't taught my older daughter to be so adventurous that she would be hiking in the mountains out of cell service range when the president called. It was the sense of responsibility to serve the community, instilled by my parents, that led me to leave my law firm to become a line prosecutor in 1989. There, one of my first assignments was to assist in the prosecution of a violent gang that had come down to the district from New York, took over a public housing project, and terrorized the residents. The hardest job we faced was persuading mothers and grandmothers that if they testified, we would be able to keep them safe and convict the gang members. We succeeded only by convincing witnesses and victims that they could trust that the rule of law would prevail. Years later, when I went to Oklahoma City to investigate the bombing of the Federal Building, I saw up close the devastation that can happen when someone abandons the justice system as a way of resolving grievances and instead takes matters into his own hands. Once again, I saw the importance of assuring victims and families that the justice system could work. We promised that we would find the perpetrators, that we would bring them to justice, and that we would do it in a way that honored the Constitution. The people of Oklahoma City gave us their trust, and we did everything we could to live up to it. Trust that justice will be done in our courts without prejudice or partisanship is what, in a large part, distinguishes this country from others. People must be confident that a judge's decisions are determined by the law and only the law. For a judge to be worthy of such trust, he or she must be faithful to the Constitution and to the statutes passed by the Congress. He or she must put aside his personal views or preferences and follow the law, not make it. Fidelity to the Constitution and the law has been the cornerstone of my professional life, and it is the hallmark of the kind of judge I have tried to be for the past 18 years. If the Senate sees fit to confirm me to the position for which I have been nominated today, I promise to continue on that course. Mr. President, it's a great privilege to be nominated by a fellow Chicagoan. I am grateful beyond words for the honor you have bestowed upon me. Thank you.
Thank you. Congratulations, man. Good job. Good job. Thank you. Muchas gracias. Thank you so much. Please. Thank you very much. To President Castro, the people of Cuba, thank you so much for the warm welcome that I have received, that my family have received, and that our delegation has received. It is an extraordinary honor to be here today. Before I begin, please indulge me. I want to comment on the terrorist attacks that have taken place in Brussels. The thoughts and the prayers of the American people are with the people of Belgium, and we stand in solidarity with them in condemning these outrageous attacks against innocent people. We will do whatever is necessary to support our friend and ally Belgium in bringing to justice those who are responsible. And this is yet another reminder that the world must unite. We must be together, regardless of nationality or race or faith, in fighting against the scourge of terrorism. We can and we will defeat those who threaten the safety and security of people all around the world. To the government and the people of Cuba, I want to thank you for the kindness that you've shown to me and Michelle, Malia, Sasha, my mother-in-law, Marion. Cultivo una rosa blanca. In his most famous poem, José Martí made this offering of friendship and peace to both his friend and his enemy. Today, as the President of the United States of America, I offer the Cuban people el saludo de paz. Havana is only 90 miles from Florida, but to get here we had to travel a great distance, over barriers of history and ideology, barriers of pain and separation. The blue waters beneath Air Force One once carried American battleships to this island to liberate, but also to exert control over Cuba. Those waters also carried generations of Cuban revolutionaries to the United States, where they built support for their cause. And that short distance has been crossed by hundreds of thousands of Cuban exiles on planes and makeshift rafts, who came to America in pursuit of freedom and opportunity, sometimes leaving behind everything they owned and every person that they loved. Like so many people in both of our countries, my lifetime has spanned a time of isolation between us. The Cuban Revolution took place the same year that my father came to the United States from Kenya. The Bay of Pigs took place the year that I was born. The next year, the entire world held its breath, watching our two countries as humanity came as close as we ever have to the horror of nuclear war. As the decades rolled by, our government settled into a seemingly endless confrontation, fighting battles through proxies. In a world that remade itself time and again, one constant was the conflict between the United States and Cuba. I have come here to bury the last remnant of the Cold War in the Americas. I have come here to extend the hand of friendship to the Cuban people. I want to be clear. The differences between our governments over these many years are real, and they are important. I'm sure President Castro would say the same thing. I know because I've heard him address those differences at length. But before I discuss those issues, we also need to recognize how much we share. Because in many ways, the United States and Cuba are like two brothers who've been estranged for many years, even as we share the same blood. We both live in a new world, colonized by Europeans. Cuba, like the United States, was built in part by slaves brought here from Africa. Like the United States, the Cuban people can trace their heritage to both slaves and slave owners. We've welcomed both immigrants who came a great distance to start new lives in the Americas. Over the years, our cultures have blended together. Dr. Carlos Finlay's work in Cuba paved the way for generations of doctors, including Walter Reed, who drew on Dr. Finlay's work to help combat yellow fever. Just as Martí wrote some of his most famous words in New York, Ernest Hemingway made a home in Cuba and found inspiration in the waters of these shores. We share a national pastime, la pelota. And later today, our players will compete on the same Havana field that Jackie Robinson played on before he made his major league debut. And it's said that our greatest boxer, Muhammad Ali, once paid tribute to a Cuban that he could never fight, saying that he would only be able to reach a draw with the great Cuban, Teófilo Stevenson. So even as our governments became adversaries, our people continued to share these common passions, particularly as so many Cubans came to America. In Miami or Havana, you can find places to dance the cha-cha-cha or the salsa and eat ropa vieja. People in both of our countries have sung along with Celia Cruz or Gloria Estefan and now listen to reggaeton or Pitbull. Millions of our people share a common religion, a faith that I paid tribute to at the shrine of Our Lady of Charity in Miami, a peace that Cubans find in La Cachita. For all of our differences, the Cuban and American people share common values in their own lives, a sense of patriotism and a sense of pride, a lot of pride, a profound love of family, a passion for our children, a commitment to their education. And that's why I believe our grandchildren will look back on this period of isolation as an aberration, as just one chapter in a longer story of family and of friendship. But we cannot and should not ignore the very real differences that we have about how we organize our governments, our economies, and our societies. Cuba has a one-party system. The United States is a multi-party democracy. Cuba has a socialist economic model. The United States is an open market. Cuba has emphasized the role and rights of the state. The United States is founded upon the rights of the individual. Despite these differences, on December 17th, 2014, President Castro and I announced that the United States and Cuba would begin a process to normalize relations between our countries. Since then, we've established diplomatic relations and opened embassies. We've begun initiatives to cooperate on health and agriculture, education, and law enforcement. We've reached agreements to restore direct flights and mail service. We've expanded commercial ties and increased the capacity of Americans to travel and do business in Cuba. And these changes have been welcomed, even though there are still opponents to these policies. Still, many people on both sides of this debate have asked, why now? Why now? There is one simple answer. What the United States was doing was not working. We have to have the courage to acknowledge that truth. A policy of isolation designed for the Cold War made little sense in the 21st century. The embargo was only hurting the Cuban people instead of helping them. And I've always believed in what Martin Luther King Jr. called the fierce urgency of now. We should not fear change. We should embrace it. That leads me to a bigger and more important reason for these changes. Creo en el pueblo cubano. I believe in the Cuban people. This is not just a policy of normalizing relations with the Cuban government. The United States of America is normalizing relations with the Cuban people. And today I want to share with you my vision of what our future can be. I want the Cuban people, especially the young people, to understand why I believe that you should look to the future with hope. Not the false promise which insists that things are better than they really are, or the blind optimism that says all your problems can go away tomorrow. Hope that is rooted in the future that you can choose, and that you can shape, and that you can build for your country. I'm hopeful because I believe that the Cuban people are as innovative as any people in the world. In a global economy powered by ideas and information, a country's greatest asset is its people. In the United States, we have a clear monument to what the Cuban people can build. It's called Miami. Here in Havana, we see that same talent in cuentapropistas, cooperatives, and old cars that still run. El cubano inventa del aire. Cuba has an extraordinary resource, a system of education which values every boy and every girl. And in recent years, the Cuban government has begun to open up to the world and to open up more space for that talent to thrive. In just a few years, we've seen how cuentapropistas can succeed while sustaining a distinctly Cuban spirit. Being self-employed is not about becoming more like America, it's about being yourself. Look at Sandra Lidice Aldama, who chose to start a small business. Cubans, she said, can innovate and adapt without losing our identity. Our secret is not in copying or imitating, but simply being ourselves. Look at Papito Valladares, a barber whose success allowed him to improve conditions in his neighborhood. I realize I'm not going to solve all the world's problems, he said, but if I can solve problems in the little piece of the world where I live, it can ripple across Havana. That's where hope begins, with the ability to earn your own living and to build something you can be proud of. That's why our policies focus on supporting Cubans instead of hurting them. That's why we got rid of limits on remittances, so ordinary Cubans have more resources. That's why we're encouraging travel, which will build bridges between our people and bring more revenue to those Cuban small businesses. That's why we've opened up space for commerce and exchanges so that Americans and Cubans can work together to find cures for diseases and create jobs and open the door to more opportunity for the Cuban people. As President of the United States, I've called on our Congress to lift the embargo. It is an outdated burden on the Cuban people. It's a burden on the Americans who want to work and do business or invest here in Cuba. It's time to lift the embargo. But even if we lifted the embargo tomorrow, Cubans would not realize their potential without continued change here in Cuba. It should be easier to open a business here in Cuba. A worker should be able to get a job directly with companies who invest here in Cuba. Two currencies shouldn't separate the type of salaries that Cubans can earn. The internet should be available across the island so that Cubans can connect to the wider world and to one of the greatest engines of growth in human history. There's no limitation from the United States on the ability of Cuba to take these steps. It's up to you. And I can tell you as a friend that sustainable prosperity in the 21st century depends on education, healthcare, and environmental protection, but it also depends on the free and open exchange of ideas. If you can't access information online, if you cannot be exposed to different points of view, you will not reach your full potential. And over time, the youth will lose hope. I know these issues are sensitive, especially coming from an American president. Before 1959, some Americans saw Cuba as something to exploit, ignored poverty, enabled corruption. And since 1959, we've been shadow boxers in this battle of geopolitics and personalities. I know the history, but I refuse to be trapped by it. I've made it clear that the United States has neither the capacity nor the intention to impose change on Cuba. What changes come will depend upon the Cuban people. We will not impose our political or economic system on you. We recognize that every country, every people must chart its own course and shape its own model. But having removed the shadow of history from our relationship, I must speak honestly about the things that I believe, the things that we as Americans believe. As Martí said, liberty is the right of every man to be honest, to think and to speak without hypocrisy. So let me tell you what I believe. I can't force you to agree, but you should know what I think. I believe that every person should be equal under the law. Every child deserves the dignity that comes with education and health care and food on the table and a roof over their heads. I believe citizens should be free to speak their mind without fear, to organize and to criticize their government and to protest peacefully, and that the rule of law should not include arbitrary detentions of people who exercise those rights. I believe that every person should have the freedom to practice their faith peacefully and publicly. And yes, I believe voters should be able to choose their governments in free and democratic elections. Not everybody agrees with me on this. Not everybody agrees with the American people on this, but I believe those human rights are universal. I believe they are the rights of the American people, the Cuban people, and people around the world. Now, there's no secret that our governments disagree on many of these issues. I've had frank conversations with President Castro. For many years, he has pointed out the flaws in the American system. Economic inequality, the death penalty, racial discrimination, wars abroad. That's just a sample. He has a much longer list. But here's what the Cuban people need to understand. I welcome this open debate and dialogue. It's good. It's healthy. I'm not afraid of it. We do have too much money in American politics. But in America, it's still possible for somebody like me, a child who was raised by a single mom, a child of mixed race who did not have a lot of money, to pursue and achieve the highest office in the land. That's what's possible in America. We do have challenges with racial bias in our communities, in our criminal justice system, in our society, the legacy of slavery and segregation. But the fact that we have open debates within America's own democracy is what allows us to get better. In 1959, the year that my father moved to America, it was illegal for him to marry my mother, who was white, in many American states. When I first started school, we were still struggling to desegregate schools across the American South. But people organized. They protested. They debated these issues. They challenged government officials. And because of those protests and because of those debates and because of popular mobilization, I'm able to stand here today as an African American and as President of the United States. That was because of the freedoms that were afforded in the United States, that we were able to bring about change. I'm not saying this is easy. There's still enormous problems in our society. But democracy is the way that we solve them. That's how we got health care for more of our people. That's how we made enormous gains in women's rights and gay rights. It's how we address the inequality that concentrates so much wealth at the top of our society. because workers can organize and ordinary people have a voice. American democracy has given our people the opportunity to pursue their dreams and enjoy a high standard of living. Now, there are still some tough fights. It isn't always pretty, the process of democracy. It's often frustrating. You can see that in the election going on back home. But just stop and consider this fact about the American campaign that's taking place right now. You had two Cuban Americans in the Republican Party running against the legacy of a black man who was president while arguing that they're the best person to beat the Democratic nominee, who will either be a woman or a Democratic socialist. Who would have believed that back in 1959? That's a measure of our progress as a democracy. So, here's my message to the Cuban government and the Cuban people. The ideals that are the starting point for every revolution, America's revolution, Cuba's revolution, the liberation movements around the world, those ideals find their truest expression, I believe, in democracy. Not because American democracy is perfect, but precisely because we're not. And we, like every country, need the space that democracy gives us to change. It gives individuals the capacity to be catalysts, to think in new ways, and to reimagine how our society should be, and to make them better. And there's already an evolution taking place inside of Cuba, a generational change. Many suggested that I come here and ask the people of Cuba to tear something down. But I'm appealing to the young people of Cuba who will lift something up, build something new. El futuro de Cuba tiene que estar en las manos del pueblo cubano. And to President Castro, who I appreciate being here today, I want you to know, I believe my visit here demonstrates you do not need to fear a threat from the United States. And given your commitment to Cuba's sovereignty and self-determination, I am also confident that you need not fear the different voices of the Cuban people and their capacity to speak and assemble and vote for their leaders. In fact, I am hopeful for the future because I trust that the Cuban people will make the right decisions. And as you do, I'm also confident that Cuba can continue to play an important role in the hemisphere and around the globe. And my hope is that you can do so as a partner with the United States. We've played very different roles in the world, but no one should deny the service that thousands of Cuban doctors have delivered for the poor and suffering. Last year, American healthcare workers and the U.S. military worked side by side with Cubans to save lives and stamp out Ebola in West Africa. I believe that we should continue that kind of cooperation in other countries. We've been on the different side of so many conflicts in the Americas, but today, Americans and Cubans are sitting together at the negotiating table, and we are helping the Colombian people resolve a civil war that's dragged on for decades. That kind of cooperation is good for everybody. It gives everyone in this hemisphere hope. We took different journeys to our support for the people of South Africa in ending apartheid. But President Castro and I could both be there in Johannesburg to pay tribute to the legacy of the great Nelson Mandela. And in examining his life and his words, I'm sure we both realize we have more work to do to promote equality in our own countries, to reduce discrimination based on race in our own countries. And in Cuba, we want our engagement to help lift up the Cubans who are of African descent, who've proven that there's nothing they cannot achieve when given the chance. We've been a part of different blocs of nations in the hemisphere, and we will continue to have profound differences about how to promote peace, security, opportunity, and human rights. But as we normalize our relations, I believe it can help foster a greater sense of unity in the Americas. Todos somos americanos. From the beginning of my time in office, I have urged the people of the Americas to leave behind the ideological battles of the past. We are in a new era. I know that many of the issues that I've talked about lack the drama of the past, and I know that part of Cuba's identity is its pride in being a small island nation that could stand up for its rights and shake the world. But I also know that Cuba will always stand out because of the talent, hard work, and pride of the Cuban people. That's your strength. Cuba doesn't have to be defined by being against the United States any more than the United States should be defined by being against Cuba. And I'm hopeful for the future because of the reconciliation that's taking place among the Cuban people. You know, I know that for some Cubans on the island, there may be a sense that those who left somehow supported the old order in Cuba. I'm sure there's a narrative that lingers here which suggests that Cuban exiles ignored the problems of pre-revolutionary Cuba and rejected the struggle to build a new future. But I can tell you today that so many Cuban exiles carry a memory of painful and sometimes violent separation. They love Cuba. A part of them still considers this their true home. That's why their passion is so strong. That's why their heartache is so great. And for the Cuban American community that I've come to know and respect, this is not just about politics. This is about family. The memory of a home that was lost. The desire to rebuild a broken bond. The hope for a better future. The hope for return and reconciliation. For all of the politics, people are people and Cubans are Cubans. And I've come here, I've traveled this distance on a bridge that was built by Cubans on both sides of the Florida Straits. I first got to know the talent and passion of the Cuban people in America. And I know how they have suffered more than the pain of exile. They also know what it's like to be an outsider and to struggle and to work harder to make sure their children can reach higher in America. So the reconciliation of the Cuban people, the children and grandchildren of revolution, and the children and grandchildren of exile, that is fundamental to Cuba's future. You see it in Gloria Gonzalez, who traveled here in 2013 for the first time after 61 years of separation and was met by her sister, Yorka. You recognized me, but I didn't recognize you, Gloria said after she embraced her sibling. Imagine that after 61 years. You see it in Melinda Lopez, who came to her family's old home. And as she was walking the streets, an elderly woman recognized her as her mother's daughter and began to cry. She took her into her home and showed her a pile of photos that included Melinda's baby picture, which her mother had sent 50 years ago. Melinda later said, so many of us are now getting so much back. You see it in Christian Miguel Soler, a young man who became the first of his family to travel here after 50 years. And meeting relatives for the first time, he said, I realized that family is family no matter the distance between us. Sometimes the most important changes start in small places. The tides of history can leave people in conflict and exile and poverty. It takes time for those circumstances to change, but the recognition of a common humanity, the reconciliation of people bound by blood and a belief in one another, that's where progress begins. Understanding and listening and forgiveness. And if the Cuban people face the future together, it will be more likely that the young people of today will be able to live with dignity and achieve their dreams right here in Cuba. The history of the United States and Cuba encompass revolution and conflict, struggle and sacrifice, retribution, and now reconciliation. It is time now for us to leave the past behind. It is time for us to look forward to the future together. Un futuro de esperanza. And it won't be easy, and there will be setbacks. It will take time. But my time here in Cuba renews my hope and my confidence in what the Cuban people will do. We can make this journey as friends and as neighbors and as family together. Sí se puede. Muchas gracias. Thank you.